Hello, I present today a new episode of our Eurointegrators program, and my guest today is Barbora Maronkova, Director of NATO Information and Documentation Center in Ukraine. Hi, Barbara.
Hello.
And Enrique Menendez, representative of NGO Responsible Citizens.
Yes, and think tank, Donbass Regional Policy Institute.
And displaced person.
Yeah, displaced person from Donetsk.
Barbara, first question is to you. Strategic course of Ukraine to EU and NATO is now in our constitution. What do you think, how it will help to cooperation between Ukraine and NATO?
Well, first of all, I'd like to state that NATO and Ukraine have many years of cooperation. In fact, since 1994, when Ukraine joined the Partnership for Peace, and 1997, when Ukraine signed a distinctive partnership with NATO, and we created the NATO-Ukraine Commission as a political forum where Ukraine can meet with the NATO representatives and discuss issues of mutual interest. Of course, after 2014, the foreign policy of Ukraine has changed its course towards Euro-Atlantic integration and, of course, European integration as well. And Ukraine has adopted a series of decisions, including changing the constitution, in way to reflect the ambitions of Euro-Atlantic integration. From NATO's perspective, we here as the NATO representation to Ukraine are to support Ukraine in its reform processes because the Euro-Atlantic integration is a process, it's a long road. Reforms need to be done. Some membership criteria, standards of NATO have to be adopted and reflected, not just for us, NATO, but also for Ukraine itself, because a stronger and prosperous and stable Ukraine is also very important for our own Euro-Atlantic security.
We have an infographic which shows regional differences of perception towards NATO, and we still have on East and especially in Donbass not so high support of NATO idea. Enrique, I know you are for EU integration, but not for NATO integration. Explain please why, and you, Barbara, can make your speech about it.
My views on joining NATO at the moment are dictated by my origin and the fact that I represent a region in which the support for joining NATO is rather small. Moreover, the opposite point of view dominates, so not just people haven't decided what they want, they consider it wrong joining NATO and rather support non-aligned status. A simple and a concise answer to this question is that, from our point of view, joining NATO may prevent the settlement of the conflict in the Donbass. Will make this condition almost eternal. And I personally consider it a big mistake that under Poroshenko NATO membership was implemented in the constitution, because this very strategic decision was made practically without relying on the opinions of the people. That is, people were not asked what they think is right at the moment for Ukraine. We see a decrease in the level of support for NATO from the date of the last survey in 2017 by 5% across the country. These regional contradictions are reflecting the number of regions affected by the conflict in the Donbass, because, as we see, the farther from the conflict zone, the higher the level of entry into NATO is. It is a paradox for many. They ask why people who live near the war don't support joining NATO. The answer here is quite simple, because NATO really should guarantee people's security, but unfortunately I think that joining NATO is more likely to guarantee that we will live on the front line forever, because Russia, as our largest neighbor, won't go anywhere. So if Russia will by all means counteract and aggressively perceive their potential accession to NATO, this will mean that this tension will always exist West, and this will cause the greatest problems in our regions. I mean, they try to sell us so that we become the front line of European security. But we don't want to be this front bastion for shields. We want to have a peaceful, prosperous country and live in a safe region in which there is no need to constantly resist external aggression. This is the most important position. It is caused only by the fact that we have an existing conflict in the Donbass, and everything that prevents its regulation, from my viewpoint, is harmful to the whole country.
Well, of course, I fully understand the rationale and the feelings of the people who live in the eastern regions, and of course, the opinion polls reflect this position of the people. Traditionally, the support for Euro-Atlantic integration and membership to NATO has been always higher in the western regions of Ukraine than in the east or in the south. But I still believe that if we compare, for example, the public level of support from, let's say, 2007 or 2011 and today, even in the east and southern parts of Ukraine, the public support has grown. Obviously not in dramatic numbers, but even at 10-15% is quite a rise compared, for example, to 11% that we used to have before. Whether or not a country joins our organization is a sole sovereign decision of the country itself. So it is really up to Ukraine and Ukrainian people to decide whether they wish to join our organization or not. What we can offer, and we do offer to Ukraine, is assistance. This assistance is in very important reforms, particularly in defense and security sector. And as I mentioned before, these reforms are not just for us or to tick some boxes in some documents that people in Brussels prepare, but these are really reforms which have been proven to work in many other countries. Post-communist countries of Central, Eastern Europe, even the countries of former Yugoslavia. So overall, the reforms can really bring an added value and strength to Ukraine itself. Whether afterwards it will continue to think about joining NATO or not, that's of course for Ukraine to decide, and Ukrainian citizens, of course, play an important role.
As far as I remember, in a country which has open conflict or occupied territories, they cannot join and be direct member of NATO. We can be only like an associated member of NATO, like Japan or like Korea.
First of all, our founding treaties, the Washington Treaty from 1949, does not provide any specificities of this kind. Article 10 states that any European country which is ready and committed to contribute to our joint security can become a member of NATO. So this is a very kind of basic article in the founding treaty. Then in 1995, after the first discussions about the first enlargement of Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland, our experts have created a study on enlargement. And this is a much more detailed document which really goes into nitty-gritties of what you need to do to join, what's the ratification process, what conditions are there. And here we do have a mentioning, but also very vague, which says that the country needs to solve its territorial problems and have good neighborly relations according to the OSCE and Helsinki Summit principles. So, of course, we cannot speculate what would be the final decision of the member states, whether yes or not, when it comes to invitation. We are a consensus-based organization, so all the member states have to decide. It's a political decision, but nevertheless, we believe at the moment we should jointly focus on the reforms.
We have one more guest. This is Denis Nemiller, head of the NGO Odessa Together. I want to hear Denis, but as far as I know, they have a slightly different view as to whether Ukraine should be a larger NATO partner. Denis, could you tell us about your position as a representative of Odessa Together? Yes, of course, with my pleasure. For example, in June we held the NATO Cold War exhibition with posters. Of course, I want to thank Barbora for the trust, because such kind of event took place in Odessa for the first time. We all know that the alliance is the guarantor of world security. If our country would become a member of it in a timely manner, then we wouldn't encounter the problems that Ukraine has unfortunately today. Donetsk, Lugansk and Crimea. So I think this kind of event to popularize NATO shouldn't be carried out systematically in different cities because, for example, in Odessa, this exhibition was very popular. So, Denis, do you think that the problem that NATO doesn't have such a percentage of support in some regions because people don't know much about it?
Виключно з тим, що люди про НАТО мало знають?
Yes, of course. It's ignorance and misunderstanding of the situation that NATO is safe, and if to popularize it, then the people will trust this organization more.
Well, thank you, Denis, for joining us, and thank you and your organization for your support in hosting our exhibit in Odessa. This is one of the ways how we like to reach out to people through public diplomacy, through cultural diplomacy, because we believe that words don't speak as loud as pictures. And we like to use educational tools, cultural tools, visual tools to increase the information and awareness amongst population about NATO. I'm not going to hide that NATO is a very complicated institution. There are a lot of stereotypes, a lot of prejudices against our organization, not only in Ukraine, by the way, in many of our member states, and it's quite logical. I mean, it's a military organization. What do they want? What do they do? They create conflicts. So, and we would like to show to people that we have been part of the modern post-World War II history for the past 70 years. And that we have, through our work, contributed to peace and security in our Euro-Atlantic area and have tried to forge partnerships with those in our neighborhood. And that, when we talk about security, security is much broader than just some military and some soldiers, and we can discuss about it.
Denis, joint military drills with the NATO Navy are conducted sometimes in your city. What do citizens of Odessa think of this? When NATO exercises were conducted about 1 month ago, and we have held a press conference with representatives of Canada. Many people came in this event, there were many experts, everything was very comfortable, there was a dialogue. In my opinion, all participants were satisfied.
Barbora, question is to you. Which benefits and advantages Ukraine can get from joining NATO or joining this partnership with NATO like Japan or Korea has? Because which concerns some parts, representatives of some parts of Ukraine have, we understand. But what is the benefits?
Well, of course, we need to look at the broader sense of what it means to be a member of NATO. As a member of NATO, you become a member of so-called collective defense organizations. So this is the core task of our organization, collective defense. That means that in case of an attack against one ally, other allies can consider to be also under attack and invoke Article 5, which means that we come to each other's defenses. And this has been the core principle of NATO for 70 years. since our founding fathers have believed that European and North American prosperity and security depend on supporting each other. So this, if you would go to the old speeches, for example, of President Truman, when he was welcoming the founding treaty of NATO, this was the idea. And let's not forget that in 1949, the world looked very different than it looks today.
Yeah.
Over the course of the 70 years, of course, the geopolitics have changed. We have been through the Cold War. We have been through the period of 90s, dissolution of Soviet Union, dissolution of Yugoslavia, the wars in the Balkans, terrorist attacks, so 9/11 against the United States, which led us to our faraway operations in Afghanistan, for example. And that ultimately led us to cooperative security with countries far away, like Japan or South Korea, Australia, or New Zealand. For example, our Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has just visited this August New Zealand and Australia, who are our partners. So obviously, the idea of some global security network has been created as a result of developments to which we need to react. So this is just a conceptual base of what it is to be a member of NATO. So collective security, number one. Of course, different countries who were joining NATO over the years, be it my own native country, Slovakia, or countries like Montenegro or Croatia, each have their additional reasons for joining NATO, based on their geography, based on their history, based on their own security needs. So it is a bit difficult to say, generally speaking, what are the additional benefits. For every country, they represent something else. But overall, we can agree that being a member of NATO provides for security, and security, as we know, is a very important factor also for economic development, strengthening of democratic institutions, etc.
I would like to clarify my position more openly. In fact, there is a need to very clearly understand that it's neither me nor the other residents of the South and East are opposite to increased cooperation, for example, to bring our army to NATO's military standards, which is an indicator of progress, the deepening of some kind of cooperation that will make our country more developed, more approximate. So for a larger number of people, cooperation with NATO is certainly associated with approaching the standards of the developed Western world. The question that worries most of all comes down to one thing: whether participation and cooperation with NATO is opposite to a comfortable neighborly life with Russia, roughly speaking. The question that causes the most discussion is whether the NATO bloc was created as a military instrument of pressure on Russia, and whether Ukraine's entry into NATO is a geopolitical level of conflict on the side of the Western world. This is the main key question, in my opinion. Here again we turn to the infographics that we saw at the beginning of our program, which showed that the citizens of the East and the South are opposite to joining NATO, but at the same time they are not supporters of joining any military alliances with Russia. I would like to remind you that we were a neutral country and this didn't save us. The question also is whether participation in NATO guarantees us from any kind of conflict. We know that two NATO members, Turkey and Greece, also have unresolved conflicts between each other, and their participation in the same security system unfortunately doesn't help them. In general, as I think joining NATO is one of the damned questions questions of Ukrainian domestic policy, which also includes the question of language, questions of humanitarian rights, a question that requires a very wide public discussion. I would like to remind you, and perhaps Barbara would like to commend this, that many of them prominent American diplomats who have made a huge contribution to the development of international politics, for example George Kennan, were opposite to the eastern enlargement of NATO. He was a famous author of the doctrine of containment of the Soviet Union in 2005, shortly before his death. He wrote that the enlargement of NATO to the east was a mistake. It was poorly prepared. Henry Kissinger later said the same thing. That's right. In 2014, already during and after the annexation of Crimea, Henry Kissinger wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal in which he said that if Ukraine's membership in NATO creates a conflict with Russia and creates an eternal point of tension, is this the right decision? It means that Ukraine needs to consider neutral status, as Finland did. In my opinion, this is a good argument, at least for discussion. So if Denis is right, and people in the south and east opposite joining NATO because they don't understand its essence, then it means that we need to be given clear answers to these questions. It seems to me that we are already in confrontation with Russia, but all wars end someday.
Of course, the issue of the NATO enlargement, as you pointed out, has not been, I would say, 100% agreed by everybody. There are different voices, also in the Western Europe, in North America. A lot has been written about the enlargement, whether or not it was the right thing to do, or if NATO should not have enlarged, etc., etc. I'm not a scholar, so I cannot provide you with some academic arguments. I am a representative of NATO, so what I can present is the view of our member states and their governments. And as I mentioned, when it comes to the decision whether or not to invite a new member state, this is based on consensus of all member states. So if whatever number of member states we have at a given moment, if they decide unilaterally that they wish to have a country join us, then we do it. If there is no consensus found, such as in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, whether to invite Georgia and Ukraine for the membership action plan, which is, let's say, a preparation for membership, then we do not act because we don't have a consensus. Now, obviously, what are the internal domestic political discussions in each country? This is something we cannot influence, and at the end, it depends really on the particular political force in power and the government in the particular country. But I would like to address a little bit the issue that you mentioned about NATO and Russia. Especially in the last 2 decades, of course, NATO was striving to build a constructive relationship with Russia. We understood that the end of the Cold War meant that we have a peace on the European continent and that we engage with our former adversaries, so to speak, so the former Warsaw Bloc countries. And already in 1994, mostly all post-Soviet Union republics, including Russian Federation, have joined the Partnership for Peace. In 1997, just as we created the NATO-Ukraine Commission to have a direct dialogue with Ukrainian leadership, we did the same with Russia. We created a NATO-Russia Council. Russian Federation has a diplomatic representation at NATO, just as all the other partner countries do. They have an ambassador there. And we have cooperated in many areas, particularly, for example, in Afghanistan, where Russian assistance support was essential. We had joint projects within our Science for Peace cooperation. The Russian soldiers, officers, could come and get training at NATO schools, just like all the other partners. So I believe NATO has really tried to build a constructive relationship, and we have had some successes. Now, of course, we also had our differences. We had our differences over the enlargement. We had our differences over the 1999 air campaigns against Milosevic's regime in Serbia at that time. But we always try to use the forum that we had, the NATO-Russia Council, to have these discussions. Unfortunately, after 2013 and the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, the support to separatists in the eastern Ukraine, this was no longer possible. So we had to stop all our activities, but we kept the channel of communication open through the political dialogue, which is the NATO-Russia Council. And we pursue a policy towards Russia since 2014, which is based on defense and deterrence, so our security, but with dialogue. So we are looking for constructive future relationships.
We have one more infographics about what NATO is doing in Ukraine. Maybe you can describe some projects and funds.
So what you see on the screen is part of our activities that we carry out through the practical support to Ukraine, which is enshrined in the document called the Comprehensive Assistance Package, which was adopted at the NATO summit in Warsaw in 2016. And it encompasses different programs. These programs also give you a bit of an idea that NATO is not just a pure military organization, but we deal with broader topics of security. So we have several trust funds. These trust funds are money which are donated by different member states for a very specific problem which we try to solve through the funding. For example, a trust fund on medical rehabilitation of Ukrainian wounded soldiers.
Of cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity, or building of your logistics centers inside the Ministry of Defense.
Enrique, are you against this cooperation? As I said, I'm not at all opposed to deepening cooperation with other Western structures. The question comes down exclusively to how this will affect the settlement of the situation in the Donbass. Is this a stumbling block, or is it not a significant factor? I don't want to advocate as a Russian lawyer here, but I have to do it voluntarily or unwillingly because they are deeply involved in the situation in Donbass. If this is a confrontation, if these types of cooperation will intensify their confrontation, forcing us to choose one of the sides, I think that this is the wrong way, and still we need to consider that here we are not discussing the issue of cooperation or not cooperation. The one thing is when your country takes part in joint military studies, and another thing is when the armies of other countries are placed on our territory. So if I am for the former, I'm against the latter. But Russian army is now placed on Ukrainian territory. If someone asks me for my support about the placing of Russian army on the Ukrainian territory, I will say, of course, no. On the territory of Ukraine, there shouldn't be armies of any other states except Ukraine. And this is obviously the point of view of the majority of citizens of the eastern and southern parts of the country. You see, now any strengthening of Ukrainian security, including through these trust funds or through cooperation programs, they will all annoy Russia anyway. So we don't have to do this. No, we need to do this by searching for forms of interaction that don't pose a threat. As I see from public statements, I certainly follow the events that Barbara talked about. The relationship between NATO and the Russian Federation, I read publications on this topic. And as far as I understand, for myself, the Russian Federation is not annoyed by the deepening of the cooperation. It is annoyed by the possibility of Ukraine participating in any aggressive actions against Russia on the side of the West, and there are very specific issues: the placing of a missile defense system, the placing of military bases. And this is actually not my conclusions, but the conclusions of Kissinger and Stephen Walt, who is a professor of political science at Harvard University. He wrote an excellent article in the Foreign Policy Journal in March 2014 about why Russia annexed Crimea. Again, in any case, I don't want anyone to suspect that I'm presenting here pro-Russian position or trying to somehow justify Russia's actions. The annexation of Crimea has no justification. This is an act of aggression against our sovereignty, and this is obvious. But nevertheless, if a deepening partnership with NATO will not help to normalize relations with Russia, but on the contrary will worsen them, this will make the conflict in my native region Donbass eternal, and is unlikely will make Ukraine more prosperous and safer country.
Of course, it's a very hard topic because we are talking about the national security of a particular country, whether it's Ukraine or any other country which is thinking about joining NATO, and they are arguments, of course, that the country and the citizens have to address. There is just one point maybe I would like to make about the location, let's say, of military bases, of NATO military bases, or the presence of NATO soldiers on the territory of Ukraine or some other country. Just a small remark here that when it comes to military bases of NATO and NATO soldiers' presence on the soil of any of our member states, this has to be done only with the approval of the particular country. So if Ukraine will not wish to have these on their territory, they will not have them. Our military presence is only either in our military missions and operations abroad, so out of our territory, like Kosovo or Afghanistan, or at the invitation of a particular member state, like for example Poland or the Baltic states, which after 2014 have requested NATO's presence and increased presence in light of Russia's aggressive actions towards Ukraine and its neighbors. So this is something that I would like to point out because we believe this is important. We have had these arguments and discussions in Montenegro, for example, when I worked there before coming to Ukraine, and the Montenegrins were really worried about having, for example, NATO ships coming and destroying their coast because it's very important coast for them, it's tourism, etc. So they were really worried, citizens particularly of the coastal areas. And we try to explain, no, I mean, there will be no military naval NATO base in Montenegro if you don't wish so. I mean, 2 years after joining, there is no military base of NATO in Montenegro. So this is just one example that if a country joins NATO, you maintain your sovereignty in decisions over foreign policy and security policy. And this is another very important factor I would like to mention, because many times people believe that if you join NATO, everything is decided in Brussels.
I was talking to our media partner from Israel, who since the new government and the new president has come here for various investment projects. The first thing he asks is how safe is here, whether we already have enough technological weapons, or we use old Soviet designs, or provided us with enough weapons to protect the investments that Western or Israel investors can make. Do you understand? This is an economic issue too. Security including economic.
Зброю для того, щоб ті інвестиції, які там західні інвестори чи там ізраїльські інвестори можуть зробити, вони були захищені. Ти розумієш, що це економічне питання також. Безпека – це в тому числі економічне.
But Israel is a very specific country. Again, I would rather compare our country with Finland or Switzerland than with Israel. But I understand what you're talking about, of course. I would like to ask one more question to Barbora, if possible.
Вопрос Барбаре задать, если это возможно. And I'd like to ask it in English. Do you have any examples in the history of NATO of such countries in Ukraine which are strictly divided they have regional difference and even 50-50 on different opposite points of view? And how do NATO treat this situation? Do you think it's a problem and you want to overcome it by some maybe educational programs, or as you mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, you treat it as a question of domestic policy, and what could be done in the situation when a big part of the country, which do not have right now, good voice in the national politics, are against NATO, and the other part of the country, which have major voice, are for the NATO. How do you treat the situation, and do you have the historical examples?
I think there are some countries where we did have a level of public opinion in terms of joining NATO and the level of public support well below the, let's say, 50% of a population. Including my own Slovakia, by the way, many years. In our case, it was because of the air campaign in 1999 of NATO against Serbia and at that time President Milosevic, because Slovakia had very close ties with Serbia, Serbian people. And the Slovak citizens at that time were not pleased with the air campaign, and they believed that this can lead to instability. So while the support for NATO was much higher before the air campaign started, after the March 1999, it went down a lot. And we also had similar questions in the society, also being, a Central European country, former post-communist country. There were discussions, we were in the Warsaw Pact and it didn't really help us because our own allies, the Warsaw Pact, has attacked and invaded Czechoslovakia in August 1968. So we had this experience, thank you very much. NATO has not been very helpful to us either in those days. They didn't come to support us in 68. So the best thing for us, we are small, just let's stay out of these things. Let's be neutral. Let's not, bother. So every country has its own historical narratives, which it needs to overcome and discuss. Similarly, in Montenegro, when the discussion started about the country joining NATO, the public support was also quite low. It was 32-35%. Again, the reason, very logical, because Montenegro at that time in 1999 was part of the federation, so they were also victims of the air campaign. So there it was even more the sentiment of the people against NATO, which is understandable. So again, I think every country has its own story to tell, and it's up to the country to come up with the narrative that works best for you. I cannot tell you what works best for Ukraine, as I couldn't tell my Montenegrin friends what works for them. We knew what would work for Slovakia. So that's important. Very, very important is to have discussions like we have now, for example.
I'm completely agree with you about discussions, because why I'm asking that questions about 50-50 support in different parts of the countries, because that could lead to a conflict, and it could be against the stability inside the society. Because if one part of society approves and another part of society against that, it would be a problem.
It's infographics about how it changed with time. But from 2014. So it started in 2014 from 34% approved, and on June of 2019 is 53 approved. So actually it grows. In some period of time it was some declining, but still it's we see trend for growth, and we see trend to decrease of those who are against. Yes, it's still only 53%. It's not so much, but it's growing.
I mean, looking at the data, I agree there are different sociological approaches. Some show 53. I even show some which showed 62% this summer. But nevertheless, of course, the dynamic changes because it reflects the mood and emotions of the people. And that is why we believe that public diplomacy communication is very, very important. That's why our office is here, and it has been here since 1997 already, so quite a long time. And I can recall when my predecessors, so the former directors of our center, were trying to reach some audiences in your region, for example, and they really had big difficulties. People were not interested, and they were almost aggressively reacting for someone even to come and want to have a discussion.
I have a point on this.
Yeah, nowadays we actually have, I would say, even the opposite problem, where we have too many invitations, where we cannot, we are not able to accept all of them simply because of time and travel and availability of speakers. How do I translate this interest? I translate this interest that people are curious. People have heard about NATO integration from their elected officials, journalists, experts, and they're curious. And this is good. If people are curious, we can talk. We can bring an exhibit. We can print a publication. We can prepare a little video. And people can look, they can read, they can visit, and they make their own ideas and their own mind about what they think is the best for them. And therefore, events like the exhibit we prepared in Odessa can help, we believe, in this outreach program. The last thing I would like to mention, however, is that I'm a very strong believer of local voices. Again, based on my experience from my country and the other countries I worked with, as a foreigner, I don't represent your country and I don't represent the voices of your country. So it has to be Ukrainian people who go and speak in Ukrainian language, address the Ukrainian domestic problems with information about what it means to be partner of NATO, cooperate with NATO, and eventually join NATO.
Yes, you're absolutely right in saying that local people should be agents of myth debunking, because the specifics of the situation is that Donbass is not just people in the east. I would include there the neighboring conflict zones of Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk. In these areas, people can not only be aggressive towards NATO, they're aggressive about the point of view that dominates here in Kiev, because there is some opposition. That is why even people who came from Kiev as Ukrainians don't have authority in the eyes of local citizens. That is why it is important to work with opinion leaders on the places. And again, if you try to abstract yourself a little with the question whether you are for NATO or against it, try to put the same survey data on other topics. For example, do people in these regions consider Russia as an enemy? Do they think we're having a war with Russia? We will see a very large correlation of this data. So people against NATO, they don't believe that we are having a war with Russia, and they don't consider Russia as the enemy. It is in this paradigm that we need to talk to them, speaking of the fact that cooperation with NATO will not mean opposing Russia and will not interfere with the settlement of the conflict. It will make the position much weightier in the eyes of these people. And it seems to me that this is the only chance we have. I completely agree that we should dispel myth, because opposing any opposition interferes with the regulation of the conflict. And in any expansion and debunking of myth helps, so therefore in this case. I'm speaking in support of information campaigns, including NATO campaigns, which will simply tell people more. I know my citizens from my region very well. They are really very greedy unfortunately, for propaganda. And unfortunately, the information from Russian sources is completely untrue. It needs to be balanced with non-aggressive propaganda and make it as close as possible to the worldview of my citizens. And in this sense, we really need to act with local organizations.
Максимально приближенной к мировоззрению моих земляков. И в этом смысле действительно нужно сотрудничать с местными организациями.
It's actually how Ukrainian citizens were voted on the last parliament election, and which party get bigger number during the last parliament election. And we can see that these regions with the most anti-NATO ideas are totally supporting opposition bloc «За життя».
That's the purple, yeah?
It's purple, yeah. I try to analyze it. Yeah, we can see that, and actually it's also new because it was not so many anti-European, anti-NATO ideas in south of Ukraine, like in Kherson, because they even didn't watch Russian television before. But now with this Krasnoperikopsk TV tower, there are some regions where OPZZ is leading. It's almost totally Donbass and Lugansk, Kharkiv next to the Russian border, and next to Transnistria and Moldova, where they also have Russian TV channels. So I also have an idea that it connected to propaganda. How NATO is dealing with Russian propaganda, by the way, in overall and in Ukraine?
Of course, the issue of disinformation and what we call the hybrid warfare has been very much on our radar screen, especially after 2014 in Ukraine. So directly and indirectly, also our policies at NATO are linked to Ukraine and vice versa. The issue of disinformation, we believe, is very serious because it undermines the values of our societies, it undermines democracy. We believe the best way against fighting disinformation is to have a functioning, robust system of strategic communication, as coordinated one-voice policy, and also to work with facts and information, what you have mentioned, because to fight propaganda with propaganda is useless. That's why we try to put as much information out as we can, engage with the journalists from all over the world, including from Russian Federation. We organize press tours, we organize press briefings, we bring experts to NATO headquarters, or we travel outside. We cooperate with the European Union, with the Center of Excellence of NATO on Strategic Communication, with the EU Center of Excellence on countering hybrid warfare, because we need to have networks in order to effectively communicate. And this is very, very important. There are a lot of NGOs in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine who do this job for us, debunking myths, tracking disinformation, sharing disinformation amongst us, whether we are government officials, whether we are NATO officials, whether we are experts and NGOs, we are all connected, and this is very, very important. When it comes to Ukraine, of course, I would say here you have some leading experts on this information. And they really do a very hard job. Over the past couple of years, also the Ukrainian government has stepped up its awareness, adopted some policies, trying to secure your information space. A lot of donors are also supporting Ukraine in this respect, in funding different media literacy programs, programs at schools for children, building the resilience of the citizens. Because if the citizens will not believe in what they see or hear or see on their smartphones, that's the best way how you succeed in fighting disinformation. And this is a long-term and difficult and very slow process, but it is the way how to approach this.
Is your organization doing something in this direction? I mean, in countering fakes?
военного сотрудничества.
Протидія фейкам, я маю на увазі.
Our organization doesn't focus on any military issues of military cooperation, but we are facing what Barbara mentioned. We are facing the facts. We are doing analysis at the Donbass Institute of Regional Policy, and I can say, by the way, that we have a project called New Youth Policy for Donbass. We did research on students who study at universities, including displaced people from uncontrolled territories. There was a question about whether young people support joining NATO. In fact, I can say that the picture is about the same as for the older ages. So it applies to all ages of the people and apparently doesn't depend on age. Because there is such a stereotype that a typical voter for the opposition platform is a person who has pro-Russian sentiments and who is nostalgic for the Soviet past. But having done our survey, it is not finished yet, but I can share some unpublished results. We saw that among young people, the situation is the same. So this is probably a part of a broader picture, because what is happening in Ukraine over the past 5 years is not only the fault line, not only about joining NATO. There are many questions open on humanitarian policy in general. And if people feel that there is some infringement of their self-identification and someone tries to aggressively change it, then naturally they will resist. Therefore, I support the idea that we need not only to fight misinformation, but also to show the image of the future in which these people will have their places, so that they understood what their life would look like. Now, a typical picture of the future if we join NATO, then the Donbass looks like an eternal front line between the West and Russia. We don't need that. We don't want that.
You didn't mention anything about the peace-building process in Ukraine and any views of what a NATO as organization have some strategy on dealing with the conflict on Donbass, because I know that we have on the previous Munich Security Conference was presented by Anders Fogh Rasmussen the strategy made by Hudson Institute about the peacekeeping mission on the east of Ukraine. Does NATO have any maybe policy papers or any impact on what are your views on the conflict resolution, and what do NATO as in Ukraine on that matters?
When it comes to the particular question of bringing peace to Donbass, we as NATO support the already ongoing formats, whether it's the Normandy format or the Minsk agreements. Should there be any new initiatives which are official and have the backing of the Ukrainian government and other partners that are necessary, of course we support whatever diplomatic means they are to the peaceful solution. As I mentioned, NATO can only do things that our member states give us as a guidance. So at the moment, NATO as such, as an organization itself, is not involved in any particular plan. But of course, should there be any such necessity and request from our member states, we will react to it accordingly.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for joining our program. Thanks, Enrique. Thanks to all who watched us. See you next week.